We're back in James today, and that's no surprise. And I've said this before, James is a wonderfully practical book. He talks a lot about how we should act. He talks more about how we should act than what we should believe. So in that sense, it's a book on praxis, which is just, the fancy way of saying actions. By the way, the book of Acts, when it was known by its Greek word, was called praxis. It was just what they do. So James talks a lot about what we should do. And today, he's really practical, like he has been in the past, and will continue to be very practical. And in this age of high-pressure internet interaction, this was very convicting to me today, so I hope to you too. I was thinking about it when you're in a position where you're living in extreme pressure, which is kind of where we're at right now. If you're living in extreme pressure, especially in the Christian community, you have one of two responses you can do when you're under extreme pressure. And it manifests in so many ways that you actually have to physically choose this direction. When you're under extreme pressure, you can either, as the body of Christ, you can pull together, you can help one another, you can make your attempt at interaction to be always about love, this pulling together kind of a thing. Even under such extreme pressure, you can do that. On the other hand, if you don't want to do that, what you can do is you can compromise what you believe with the various factions in the world, and then as you ally yourself with those factions, the body of Christ itself becomes factious. It's one of those two things. And so that's what we see going on right now. Part of the Christian community is picking sides in a lot of the debates, and as a result, that faction that is in the world becomes a part of the body of Christ. Or you can say, regardless of whether which side is right or wrong, I know you're saying, well, I only picked the side that's right, so get off my back. No, what you need to do in the other case is always say, in a sense, right and wrong that's an important issue. But the issue really is, are you going to aim yourself at loving one another? That's the issue. And so today, that ends up being an overriding look today as James comes back to living under extreme pressure situations. Remember, he started off saying, count it all joy when you encounter trials. And, we read that and we go, count it all joy when you experience trials. You don't really believe that when you read it, but you can, and he explains why you can believe that. So the entire overarching theme of his book is, how do you act in the middle of extreme pressure? Are you going to divide with the factions of the world and hence split the body of Christ? Or are you going to set your mind and your heart and your actions specifically toward loving one another and using that to moderate everything that happens after that, right? Today, he'll actually focus on the action of your speaking. So let's just start it out. We're in chapter 1, verse 19. And he says, know this, which means actually you do know this. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. And I did a short survey of all the conversations I've been listening to on the internet. And none of them are quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. They're exactly the opposite on all those. Fast to anger, fast to speak, never hear. That's the way it works. Now, if you're a human being, you fall sway to the same tendencies when you are online. I know I do when I'm online. And someone will say something online, and I'll hear it. I'm quick to hear. Come on, Jim, get off my back. I heard what they said. And then I just exploded all over them. I got so mad. In fact, I took a month off the internet in June while Dorothy was in Spain. I thought this is a good time to do something different, so I got off the internet and just went cold turkey. I got emails and texts, but Facebook, the rest of YouTube, everything else was just gone. So most of the dialogue, the infectious dialogue, I stopped putting into my life. And suddenly the sky got bluer, the birds sang louder. It was a wonderful thing. And then I came back in July and went right back into it. Right. Quick to hear? No. Slow to speak? No. Slow to anger? No. Those things don't accomplish anything. In fact, as I was thinking about my internet interactions, because most of us, when we're talking about what you do when you talk, as we're in a lot of these shutdowns and these close-ins, what we do when we talk now is dominated by what you do on your computer. It really is. It's dominant. So this is just really applicable. And so I was thinking in a practical sense, how are you quick to hear when you use the internet? What do you do? I know what quick to hear looks like when I have someone next to me. right? I mean, someone comes up to you in some context, when you're 6 feet apart, and they come up to you. This is what quick to hear looks like. And the other person, if they're quick to hear, does this. And then you're both just staring at each other. No, that's not necessarily quick to hear. It's sort of quick to hear. So this is an attitude. If you're quick to hear, the clue that you're quick to hear is that the first words that come out of your mouth when you meet someone is usually a question about them. That's your clue. Because you're saying not just, hey, how are you? Fine. How are you? Fine. That wasn't quick to hear. It's something that probes into the quality of their life. You want to hear what's going on in their life. I've been convicted about this particular aspect of how you deal with people like forever. And there's one woman, I was thinking, in my entire Christian experience, one woman sticks out in my mind as being a paragon of exhibiting this very attitude when she's with people. I have taken notes about her my entire life. No, it's not Dorothy, actually. So you probably think, oh, this is just so sweet. Well, we're both learning. But we know this through Lorraine Halverson. You guys know Lorraine Halverson. Lorraine Halverson, who's about 20 years older than us, I'll tell you, every time you'd come face to face with Lorraine Halverson, she would ask you instantly about something that's going on in your life. And you'd have these long conversations. She's drawing out of you, and she's listening to where your life is at. She is just so good at this. I hope she sees this, because I've never told her this, but I've been taking notes off this woman for 40 years about how you do this. And it never fails. We saw them, I don't know, about 2 years ago. They're up in Spokane, and we saw them. And we hadn't seen them for so long. I wanted to know what they were doing. So I thought, I'll do a Lorraine thing. So Lorraine, how's life going? I'll start the ball off, and I'll be quick to listen by asking about her life. And doggone it if she didn't turn it around in 30 seconds. And she's asking me about my life and the details. I mean, she's inquisitive, and she's listening to what I'm saying and asking questions based on what I'm saying. She's listening. She is quick to listen. And then, after that conversation was done, I thought, well, nuts. I don't know anything about Lorraine now, because all she did was actively listen to me. So that's what we're talking about in terms of that. But we don't do that on the internet. We don't do that on the internet. In fact, I was reading in World Magazine. I don't know if you get World Magazine. It's kind of like the Time of the Christian Community. It's really a very good publication. And they do book reviews. And they recently did a book review of a guy. I wrote down this quote because I just thought this was outstanding. What a great way to capture what we do on the internet instead of active listening. The author's name is Daniel Darling. You can remember that, right? Daniel Darling. And he has a book that's called Away with Words. And it just came out. It just came out about 2 months ago, I think it was. Anyway, as he's talking about what we do on the internet and how we just sound off on the internet, he evokes the story that we know in Luke 18 about the tax collector and the Pharisee at the temple who are praying publicly. You remember that in Luke 18? And the Pharisee gets out there and says, "Oh God, thank you that I'm not like this man." He's a tax collector. And he goes on and on. He's just doing this big public, you remember this, right? Look, a big public prayer thing, just making a big show of how righteous he is. Well, Daniel Darling, in Away with Words, suggests that maybe that's sort of what we're doing when we use the internet. He says, social media often brings out our inner Pharisee. Every day, it seems, we are at our digital temples, crying loudly for everyone to hear that we are so very unlike those other people. And that's kind of what we do on the internet. I think we're doing more to parade ourselves than necessarily do much good. So how are you quick to hear? That's really the question. Well, how do you do that? A while ago in adult Sunday school class, we covered a book by Greg Kuchel called Tactics. I'd recommend it to anybody. Tactics is a great book because Greg Kuchel is an apologist. He's a Christian apologist, and so he specializes in how to refute errant claims about the Bible. And his secret weapon is listening. Wait, an apologist who listens? Yes, an apologist. I mean, not an apologist who stands on the street corner and yells at people with a bullhorn, No, an apologist who listens. And that's why I just love this, because the approach is actually quite natural for us. It's quick to hear. And if you did that course of this, do you remember what he said when you first encounter somebody? What you need to ask when they say something is, here's the quick to listen question, what do you mean by that? And then you let them kind of paint the picture. You're quick to listen rather than jump on top of them based on your prejudices. What do you mean by that? And then when they explain what you mean by that, there's actually a great second follow-up question that you can do, and you can ask them, so how did you come to that conclusion? We're asking them for evidence, basically. And so you're pulling all this stuff out, and as they're painting a picture for where they're coming from, and you're actively listening, quick to listen to what they're saying, then you can interact with them in a more knowledgeable way and wait for an opportunity for the issues of truth to work their way into the context that they just set. He said it's sort of like, he calls it the Columbo technique. Remember Columbo? You have to be old to remember Columbo, sorry. Columbo's been off the air for a long time. Oh, it's been in reruns. Okay, anyway, Columbo, remember Columbo? He would come on a crime scene. He looks totally disheveled. His raincoat or whatever that was, overcoat, looks just like it hasn't been cleaned in probably 30 years. It looks all rumpled. He looks all rumpled. His hair is like this. So the first impression he makes in the room is not the impression that corporate advisors say you should make when you carry yourself in corporate. You shouldn't look this disheveled because everyone will think you're just a loser. Well, that was actually part of his strategy. So Columbo would come into a room and there's people there he needs to talk to. And do you remember what he does? He looks around. He doesn't say anything for a long time. And then as he turns around to go to the door, he spins around and says, oh, wait. I have a question about something. Something's not making sense to me. You can help me out. You can help me out here. This doesn't, wait, okay, what about this? And he asks this very simple, very unassuming question. And the person then answers, and then Columbo tailors his next question based on what they answer. And then he goes, okay, he writes something with his little stubby pencil on his piece of paper. The people in the room figure this guy's a loser. He's not going to pick up anything I just said. And sure enough, they win because he turns to go to the door again. And then he takes 2 steps toward the door, and what does he do? He flips back around and says, well, something doesn't make sense to me. Let me ask you this. And so it's bumbling in a sense. It's very humble. It's very humble. It's very unassuming. So when Greg Koukl wrote his book about tactics, he says that's what we need to be. We need to be quick to listen, ask questions about, what do you mean by what you just said? Don't just jump down their throat presuming you know what they said. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And how did you come to that conclusion? So there's very simple things, and not be, we talk about in some stuff that we provide at the church about not being a top-down approach with other people, like I know more than you do, and now I'm condemning you by what I say next. You don't want to have that position. You want to be kind of in the under position where you're coming to people saying, I don't quite understand. Can you help me out here? Because you've probably figured this out. Help me out. What is this? So you become basically the student and they become the teacher. Always keep that relative thing there because Columbo did that well. Koukl does that well in tactics. Always be the person under who's serving out of love. And move the conversation into a productive area based on questions. That's quick to listen. So a person who's quick to listen, if you want to kind of score yourself on how you're doing on James 1:19 on quick to listen, take an inventory survey of the last time you had a face-to-face with someone, or even a text-to-text with someone, and ask yourself, was your first interchange a question about their well-being or something that really is important in their life? Did you do a Lorraine Halverson? Right? That's how you can tell if you're quick to listen. So be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. And this anger right here isn't just the fact that you have anger that erupts. You have anger that erupts all the time. In fact, just before I went on my internet fast at the beginning of June, the last week of May, something just sporadically came across the screen. I think it was on my computer. No, it was on the TV at home. We were doing some YouTube stuff. Anyway, something came across the screen, and it just lit me off. I know, it's hard to imagine Jim angry, but I was angry. I was really angry. And I said something back to the TV screen immediately. I was mad. And it was that reaction, that visceral anger that just erupted out of nowhere that sort of scared me. Because he says, no, be slow to anger. Well, I wasn't slow to anger. I was fast to anger. I was lit off like a fuse, and I was quick to speak, and I was talking at the TV set. Tell me that doesn't make a lot of silliness. And that's partly what alarmed me and that caused me to go on my internet fast, because something was wrong inside of me triggered. Well, this anger he talks about is is not so much the kind of anger that erupts spontaneously, like that was. I mean, you don't want to live that out. Anger will spontaneously erupt in you, and you really have almost no control about when it erupts. It's just there. You really can't control it. You can control what you do as a result of anger when it erupts, but when it erupts, it's just there. So just, mind your P's and Q's after it erupts. But that's not quite what he's talking about here, because that's a natural sort of response in many ways. He's talking about an anger that kind of, it's more in the background all the time. You're an angry person, we would say about something. You're an angry person. So he's saying that if you're a person who is constantly angry about something, you can never seem to quite get out of that hole of being angry. You really don't want to communicate with people when you're in that condition. Now, you already know this because you've had people come to you, right, when they were angry. And you usually take 2 or 3 steps back, and if it's all about you doing something wrong, you go into this apologetic tirade, like, well, no, I didn't mean, no, what do you do? What do you say? And you're taking steps. It's impossible to communicate when someone's angry, especially when they're angry with you. And you want to sort of take it down, take it down a couple notches. Chill. You need to chill. So anger is so torpedoes our communication. That's why he says, be quick to hear, but slow to speak and slow to anger. That's just really, it's a big deal. If you really want to communicate with people and make inroads for the gospel, you need to start listening to people's lives first before you speak into their lives. And definitely don't let the nature of their lives make you angry and then speak out of anger to them. I've had people that I talk to all the time who come in a counseling situation, and they'll recount the problems they're having right now, and they're real problems. I mean, there's just no way of saying they're not real problems. They're real problems. But then as you ask some questions, quick to hear, as you're asking questions to kind of unwind where that came from, you suddenly, like 95% of the time, you wind back to a historical decision that was made that was really stupid. I mean, it was very unwise. Just very unwise. And you can draw a straight line between that decision and where they're at today. And the least productive thing you can do in that situation is say, well, it's your darn fault because you made this stupid decision. What were you thinking over here? Didn't your parents teach you anything? What is your problem? It's not I can't help you now. You did that to yourself. I'm bye. Now, this just makes me so angry at people. That's not real productive. Because people are still where they are. I've done this, and I've gone to God, and I'd say, I've got this tremendous problem. And God, in his wisdom and in his gentleness, he'll unwind it backwards for me and go, well, Jim, boop, what about this? Go, well, that was kind of unwise, right? Yeah. So God does this. He's quick to listen. He's gentle. He's there to support us. He's not there to get angry at us and thinking that his anger will cause us to finally change our lives and do the right thing. No, that's not the case. Well, he goes on. We're only in the first verse this morning. Holy smokes. The verse goes fast. We've only been talking about quick to listen, quick to hear when it talks to other people. But what if actually the issue is you being quick to listen when it comes to God? Do you ever, in your prayers, launch off in your prayers to God? Say, God, I got a bone to pick with you. Here's my situation. And then the more you kind of recount your problems, you get angrier and angrier. And then finally at the end, you've got this big head of steam up and say, so God, do something. Are you asleep? Maybe you don't have those prayers. I do from time to time. No. What if the quick to listen is quick to listen to God? In fact, he starts to go that way because he goes into verse 20. And he says, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Oh, so we're actually talking spiritual issues right here. I mean, that can apply to person, but then he goes on and he says, therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. Well, wait, it has nothing to do with person-to-person interaction. It has to do with listening to God's word. And he says, basically, you need to be slow to anger because the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. What does it produce? 21. It produces filthiness and rampant wickedness. It's going to completely produce the wrong thing. Not only in your life, but in other people's lives as well. And then he says, here's the quick to listen. He says it there at the end of verse 21. Receive with meekness the implanted word. I'm listening. I need to listen to his implanted word, which is able to save your souls. So he says the implanted word because he says it's something you already know. You've already heard this. You've already listened. You already know this. You know more than you're doing is what he's saying. So what you need to do is slow yourself down, and you need to let that implanted word, which you already know, you need to let that do something inside. You need to have it moderate your actions. You need to have it be active in your life, not just say, well, yeah, I read that, but it doesn't mean much to me, so I'm not going to change any of my actions as a result of that. No, you got to allow it to do something powerful. He says it actually will save your souls. Now, he's not talking about salvation, save your souls. This is the sense in which the word is used in terms of rescuing, because the word salvation always has meant rescue. And in the bigger sense, it means rescue from the imprisonment of sin. In this case, it's rescue from the imprisonment of your own angry, filthiness and rampant wickedness. Because we do know that this flesh, which we talked about last week, which is a tendency to sin, tends to entrap you and cause you to be in its grip. So he says, you need to let the word which you already know, which is implanted, you need to be quick to hear that. Be quick to hear that. Well, Jim, I read the Bible all the time. I mean, I'm quick to hear all the time. Oh, yeah. Yep, I do this. I'm already a hearer, Jim. I'm already a hearer. So get off my back. So James knows you're going to make that argument, so he moves on to the next section about the fact that you think you're already a hearer. And he says in 22, well, be doers of the word and not hearers only. Well, okay, wait a second. I thought you said I need to be a hearer. I do. Well, you need to also be a doer coupled with your hearing. Okay, so what's that all about? He says, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. You deceive yourself if you think you're hearing the word, but it's not breaking through to change anything inside of you, and it's not changing your behavior. You're not a doer. You know, in Christianity, where we just so love the gospel of being saved by grace through faith, I mean, that's not just something we love. It is the dominant theme of the entire Bible. I mean, it goes all the way back to Abraham. So about the whole idea about the fact that our justification, our position with God is all based not on what we do, but on what he has done for us. And so we accept his grace, which is what he's done on our behalf for us. Through faith, we believe it and trust him. And then that rescue, the big rescue happens. But what he's saying right here is that there's a rescue that goes on every day that has to be about you doing something. Now, you know, we look at this and go, well, my belief system has very little to do with doing things. It's all about believing. Yeah, it's all about believing. And no, maybe when we talk about the capital S salvation, the big rescue from sin and being part of God's family, that's doing on Jesus' part. That's not doing on your part. A better delineator when it comes to doing is to substitute, when you see the words doing or works, substitute the word earn. Substitute the word earn. You cannot earn God's salvation by what you accomplish and do. However, once we come to Christ, what we do is a big thing. It's a big thing. Remember at the outset of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, let your good works so shine before men that they glorify your God in heaven. Oh, no, I'm not supposed to do works, Jim. I listen to preachers all the time online. They say I'm not supposed to do works. I'm just supposed to sit here and believe. And let your good works so shine before men. Not that they glorify you, but they glorify God in heaven. That's just the beginning of this theme in the New Testament. I started looking through and found out, remember, speaking of Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, when he talks about the guy who builds his house in the sand and the guy who builds his house in the rock. What's the difference between the two? Because they both hear the word. They both hear the word. The difference is, Matthew 7:24, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like the wise man who built his house in the rock and does them. Not just hears them and they go into your head, but somehow they incorporate it into your very actions. They become a part of who you are. Is that alone? Well, no, there's tons of other places. John 13:17, Jesus said, look, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So you'll find this as a theme all the way through. What James is getting at is, yes, I want you to be a hearer of the word, absolutely. In meekness, be a hearer of the word. But I want you to understand that just hearing is not enough. Hearing should result in doing. And if you're not seeing doing, there's something broken in your hearing. He'll come back to this when he talks about faith. Okay, so you say you have faith. We'll read this later. You say you have faith. Well, I say to you that if your faith isn't demonstrated somehow, maybe you don't have real faith. Same is true here in terms of if you hear the word and do, it should come out. If anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. Hold that thought. This is great. I can selectively blind people with this. So, I mean, it's always good to use a illustration as he uses an illustration. A hearer of the word who's not a doer is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror, for he looks at himself and he goes away and at once forgets what he was like. That's pretty stupid. I mean, if I have something hanging out of my nose, or I have a piece of hair out of place, or have long nose hairs, I'd struggle with that. But if you look at that and you go, yeah, whatever. That's what a person who listens to the word but doesn't do anything about it. It's like that. It's like that. And then he qualifies for us what this word is. This is really a great insight. He looks at himself, he goes away, this is 24, and at once he forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he'll be blessed in his doing. And in this one passing phrase, James gives us a great insight into the nature of the law. The law was a prescription God gave to Israel to tell them what a citizen in God's kingdom does and looks like. That's what the law was. This is what a citizen does. This is what someone who loves God does. This, in a sense, in the time of Israel, was a statement of what righteousness looks like. And there were things involved in the law. It was broad, that included both what you did in the government, if you want to put it for that way, the administration of the nation, as well as other things. But the law was really meant to be a mirror of you, and for you to look at it and for you to say, wow, I have a lot of warts. That's what the law was meant to do. You know, the Jews today and back then would say, no, the law is something you're supposed to accomplish. And then when you accomplish it, you earn God's justification through it. That's a works-based righteousness. The law was never meant to do that, James says. The law was meant for you to look at it and go, oh man, I'm coming up short. And Paul underscores that later on. That's what the law does. The law shows you how you come up short. And it was never really meant to be something that they could 100% do. And you know how I know that? Not just because we can't do it, but because when you go back to the Old Testament and you look at the law, do you know how much of the law and how much of the role of the temple deals with your failings to do the law? What are you talking about? All the sacrifices? God put together a system saying, you're not going to do it. You'll see the law, you'll look at yourself, and you'll try, but you'll come up short. So I've instituted a whole line of things you need to do to deal with the fact that you are always a loser when it comes to the law. And when you look at the temple, that dominated the activity in the temple 24/7. Well, 24/6. Oh no, 24/7. Okay, that dominated it, dealing with the problem of our shortcomings. That's what the law was always. The law was not meant to be an unreasonable status for people. What God was saying was, look, if you want me as your king and you want to be in my kingdom, here's the standard. And you won't be able to do it. So you're constantly reminded, as the writer of Hebrews says, about what goes on in the temple back in Solomon's time. You're constantly reminded of the fact that you try and you want to do the right things, but you can't do the right things. And so you go to the temple and you sacrifice something to deal with the fact that you seem to always fall short. That would be the line of reasoning for any Jew that was in the Old Testament. I always fall short. But thanks be to God, in his graciousness, he forgives me. That was the model. It wasn't, here's the law, do it perfectly, and everything will be fine. Well, that's unreasonable. In fact, again, near the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus sidles up next to the Pharisees and says to the people at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, look, if your righteousness doesn't exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, you're never going to see the kingdom. And I think the people, if I was doing the movie, the people in the crowd would go, oh no. And then the Pharisees would go, yeah, oh no. Jesus says everyone was out, including the Pharisees, who had the law. And not because they weren't diligent in trying to do it, but because by our fallen nature, we cannot. And yet it gives us a great understanding of God's plans for us, warts and all. And that's why when he talks about in this, he calls it the perfect law. Perfect doesn't just mean no sin. Perfect law, that word perfect is this teleos word which we keep hitting on it. It means actually the end of a process in your life. It's a goal where you're going, right? So if you go on a cross-country trip and you take a map with you, the teleos will always say, this is where I'm going. Although today I'm in Kansas and tomorrow I'm in wherever, stuff like that. But what's your teleos as you're on the road? Well, it's where I'm going. It's where I'm going. So teleos is always a sense of a completed act being done. So that, in that sense, it is perfect because God's looking to change you into something that you were not ever before, now that you've come to Christ. He's in the process of changing you in this. That's the teleos law. So the teleos law, we look at ourselves and go, man, I don't match up. But I want to match up. I want to. I want that to be part of my life. I want what the law says right here to be incorporated into my life. And so the writers in the Old Testament, the author of Psalm 119, so many others, they say, Lord, I look at your law, and it's sweet to me like honey. The law? Yeah, the law. Because it captures a sweet righteousness that once we now have come to Christ, we love the beauty of that righteousness. What am I talking about? I've talked about this before, but when you see someone do a very selfless, loving act with somebody else, doesn't something inside of you leap up and go, yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's because God's rechanging who you are. He's changing your heart. He's changing you to appreciate the things that who God himself is like. And so when suddenly we see people living in ways that display some characteristic of God, we say, that's beautiful. Beautiful, defined in biblical terms, is everything that God is. And so when we see that incorporated into the actions of people, something inside of us resonates and goes, oh, that's beautiful. And then when we analyze our own behavior, we go, I wish I was more like that, because it's beautiful. And I go to God, this is the process, say, God, can you do this in me? Because I want this to be a part of who I am. I really do. I want this to be a part of who I am. And he uses the law to give us tips about what that looks like in completion, but he's the one that does it. And he gives us a mirror in the law to show us how we're really not like that, but he gives us a desire to want to be like that. And he does that in us. So that's what he says. You need to have your ears open to this. The one who looks into the perfect law, into the law of liberty, liberty actually being freed from the tyranny of sin, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, you just didn't read it, but being a doer who acts. He'll be blessed in his doing. So he's talking about here, we thought at first about being quick to listen with other people. Now we're talking about being quick to listen to his word. And by the way, when you're quick to listen to his word, you'll find out how much you come short, but how much you really want to be different. And God will change you in that way. That's what he gets at. So, he anticipates another question in your mind at the end of this section. Okay, so I was a hearer before, and he says, well, okay, so you're a hearer, but you're not a doer. Are you doing what you're hearing? And at the end of this section, you say, well, yeah, I think I'm responsive to the word. Yeah, I'm a doer. I'm a doer. And then he jumps in the next section to tell you that maybe you're not a doer. What? Come on, get off my back, James. See, he's very practical. He says in 26, talking to doers, people who think they're doers from listening to the word. If anyone thinks he's a doer, actually he says if he's religious. That word religious there just means the outward actions that follow from what you believe. It comes out as worship in some translations because it's the outward evidence that you believe something. He says, if anyone thinks he's a doer, but does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's doerness is worthless. So religion is worthless. So he's saying, oh, okay, so you're telling me you're a doer. But look, let's get back to the tongue again. If you're a doer and you still haven't bridled your tongue, then your doerness that you do in your religion is zero. Zip, it means nothing unless you bridle your tongue. Because one of the first areas that being a doer of the word should impact is bridling your tongue. Really? Yes. And why is that? Well, if you go through the process and realize that sin is actually selfishness, Tozer called it the hyphenated sins of self, self-dependence, self-absorption, self-almost anything. That's sin. Sin is a tragic over-attention to self. and the needs of self and what self wants to do. It comes back to Isaiah 53 that all we like sheep have gone astray and gone on our own way. So self is on our own way. That's what it's all about. So if you realize that that's really what sin is altogether, sin ought to be something that when God eradicates it in our life, he changes everything in who we are, and especially bridling our tongue. Because when you fail to bridle your tongue, your motivation is almost always selfish. Almost always. And so one of the very first things that gets changed in your life when the Lord comes into your life is he starts to bridle your tongue. So that's why he's saying to you, okay, you think you're a doer of your religion? You think you're a doer? Well, look, if you don't bridle your tongue, you're just deceiving yourself. You're deceiving your own heart. You think that you've got this whole religion thing figured out. You think that you're worshiping God well, but man, your tongue is still just out of control. Now, this is a theme James will hit on a lot before he finishes the book. If you think this is the end of the tongue theme, you're grossly mistaken. It gets worse than this. But he says this is the chief indicator that something has changed, that you're a doer responding to what you hear in that sense. Now, why is selfishness the driver to what you say? I can't tell you how many times that I have conversations with people, and it's the first words out of their mouth is always about something about them. Now, I understand there's needs in our lives, and I'm quick to listen, and I listen about that. That's okay. I'm not putting that down because some of us are under gigantic weights and piles. I get that, and I compassionately listen. But many times that drive to be heard is totally selfish-oriented rather than help me, I'm going under for the third time oriented. It's just, I thank you for giving me an audience. Now I can talk at you for the next half hour. And that's he's saying, you need to bridle that tongue. The tongue is often a vehicle for venting our selfishness with other people. It's very seldom about somebody else. Because if it was about somebody else, you would do a Lorraine Halverson and ask them how their life is. But since it's not about them, it's about you. You go on about you. So that's one of the first things that God changes and continues to work on. He does with me as well, is bridling the tongue. Because the tongue is an indicator of a tragically self-consumed person. Ask someone else what's going on in their life and be sincere about it. Say, I want to know what's going on over there. So he caps this off about us who claim to be doers of the word. 27, he says, a religion that's pure, or a doing of religion that's pure. You know what it looks like, he says? This is what it looks like. This religion that's pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, to keep oneself unstained from the world. That's the outworking of your beliefs. That's your religion. You mean it's not, and you can make a list of things you think it is. What, you mean my religion lived out is visiting orphans and widows in their affliction and keeping myself unstained from the world? That's the supreme outworking of what I believe? Yeah. Because remember I said selfishness reigns in the sinner's heart. Sin is self. You could almost put an equal sign. Sin equals self. It's self just dominates everything. If that's the case, then what happens when God changes your heart and you become selfless? You become selfless. Well, you become quick to listen. What happens when you come upon someone who has much less than you do, someone who's in deep need, and you're selfless? You attend to their needs. You visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Now, this orphans and widows is not an accidental mention right here. In their culture, those are the two classes of people that had nothing. There was actually a third class. That was strangers traveling in the land. And it's so much the case that when God establishes Israel in the promised land after he brings them out of Egypt, and he says, look, this is how I want you to live. Here's the law. He says, one of the things that's like me, he says, that I want you to do is that when strangers come through your land, you need to take care of them. You need to bring them into your house. You need to say, hey, had dinner? Yeah, but I'm a Canaanite, or I'm an Egyptian, or I'm a Syrian. Or, that doesn't matter. Come sit down at our table. Let's have dinner together. Tell me about your life. Tell me where you're going. What's going on? You need to be hospitable, God says, with strangers, because strangers have no one in the land for them. There's no one. They're strangers. And the same is true of orphans who've lost fathers and mothers. You lose a father and mother in their culture, You have no one who's engaged on your behalf. Visiting orphans, people who are powerless. Widows, the same way, because of the patriarchal nature of the society there. If a woman suddenly found herself a widow, she had no power in the structure. I mean, even land and stuff like that was lost. Who's going to speak on behalf of the widow? Well, the people who will are the selfless ones. That's what changes, James says. You want to talk about what real religion, what being a real doer looks like when we follow Jesus? It's being aware of the people who are in need and doing something about it. And doing something about it. This has been the history of the Christian church since its very beginning. I was reading some accounts in the 2nd century, early 3rd century of pandemics that came through the world during that time. And we're talking deadly stuff. We're talking deadly stuff, where if the virus comes into the house, half the household members would die. And in that time, they were smart enough to know that if you keep people together in a house, and we know this because of this pandemic, that they basically infect one another. So what the early non-believers would do, and some believers did as well, is as soon as someone showed symptoms in a household, you know what they did? They picked them out and they threw them out in the street. Said, bye, you can't be inside here. And then they would let them die. They wouldn't feed them, they wouldn't give them water, because in their sense, even though it's a tragic loss, it's as though they would look at that family member and say, I'm sorry to have to do this to you, but you know what? You're already dead. It's just going to take you a while to get there. So I'm going to send you outside and speed up your death. I won't even feed you. So you know what the Christians did? I read about this. They would go find the people who had been cast out, who were laying in the streets, and they'd feed them. And they'd give them water. And they'd care for them. Well, don't you know you're likely to get infected by doing that? Sure, they knew that. They knew that. But because they had started following Jesus and Jesus had started transforming their insides, they became less selfish and more selfless. And so when they saw people in need, regardless of whether they had 1 day to live or 30 years to live, in a selfless sense, they would come to them and they would attend to them. That's what God would do. That's what Jesus would do. That's what he does as he's in us. So he says right here, if you want to talk about real religion, real worship, real outgrowth of what you believe, you need to be selfless, because that's what he'll do inside of you. You won't be consumed with yourself anymore. It won't be all about me. It'll be about somebody else. And then when you see people in genuine need, the doerness inside of you engages and does something. It does something. Religion that's pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. That last line is not a throwaway, to keep yourself unstained from the world, because you realize if you go back to the pandemic issue in the 2nd century, being stained by the world would be to say, I see need in the streets, but I'm not going to do anything about it, because after all, I need to save my own skin. My skin's more important than their well-being. That's being stained by the world. That's where selfishness starts to creep in. This world that we live in is totally ruled by selfishness. Totally ruled by selfishness. And James is going to speak on that later too in James 3. He's just going to, in fact, I think we mentioned it last week. He said, hey, you want to know why things are really tough in your community? It's because you're all being driven by your own selfish passions, and you're fighting each other, and you want what you want and not what other people have, and you're killing each other, and you're saying bad stuff again. That's why you have problems in your community, because you're all dominated by self. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. And even the founders of this country understood that a country that's based on the very lean laws that they put together won't survive unless you have a people who understand the fact that they need to not be consumed with self, and they need to be selfless and be concerned about other people in the process. They need to be self-restrained because of that selflessness. And Adams himself said, look, if ever it gets to a time where this country that we're starting doesn't get this, or they don't find this self-restraint in selflessness and caring for one another, everything doesn't work, because we just basically haven't structured the laws tight enough to deal with people who are consumed with their selfishness, because we'd have to clamp down a lot harder than we did. But they chose to work toward liberty. We want you to be free to do what you do, but you got to understand we're counting on the fact that God is in the process of transforming you away from your selfishness and into your selflessness. And a community that doesn't do that voluntarily has to have a government that writes laws in a punitive way to force people to act good to each other. And that's not a really good solution either. Founders knew that. Well, we need to quit right here. I was thinking this whole thing about orphans and widows. Isaiah 1 says it really clearly as well. Just about the opening breath in Isaiah, when God is painting a picture for how bad things are in Israel. Selflessness has been gone away. He says in Isaiah 1:16, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. That's being unstained from the world, that James says in chapter 27. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. I think I preached this to our kids once. Stop doing bad things and start doing good things. God is interested in what you do, not just what you believe. Let me just finish that. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause, the powerless people. Stop being a selfish fool who does not see the need that's around him. And then just one more, and when we talk about the law and what God demands of you now that you've come to Christ, when Jesus is kind of tearing apart the Pharisees in Matthew 23, this verse always rings in my ears, because the Pharisees were masters at the minutia of the law, the masters of the minutia of the law, and they thought that by doing the minutia of the law, they were earning God's respect. So Jesus takes them down a notch in just a few words. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, no two for that, hypocrites. There we go. For you tithe mint, dill, cumin, tiny, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law. So what are the weightier matters of the law? Check it out. Justice, mercy, faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the other stuff. You should do these things. Justice, mercy, faithfulness. God does want you to be a doer of what you believe. He is actively transforming the insides of you to be more like Him. Why? To glorify Him. So that when people say, hey, I knew you when you were in high school. You were a real jerk. Or you were really petty. Or you were, fill in the blank, whatever fits for you. I'm trying not to make eye contact. You were just like this. And now I meet you at our 20th anniversary reunion of high school, and you're a different person now. Well, I don't get it. I mean, you seem to be concerned about other people. You never were when you were in high school. You seem to be doing things I never guessed you would ever be doing. I mean, how is it that the supreme jock of the football team is now a missionary in Ghana? What is going on here? What happened to you? I would never have predicted this. This was not in the yearbook of person most likely to become a missionary in Africa. What happened? And you can say, well, I met Jesus. And since that time I met him and I committed my life to him, to follow him, he's been changing me. Things have been going so different in my life. And it's not a matter of me looking at some kind of handbook on how to do things good and do things bad. He's been changing me, and I've been falling more and more in love with the character of who God is. I've been falling more and more with the love of not loving myself and loving other people. And that's why I saw the need in Ghana, and that's where I am. And it's the best thing I could ever do, and I love it more than anything else I could possibly be doing. And people will shake their head and go, well, I don't get it. I agree with you, that's a beautiful thing to do, but I just don't understand such a radical change. And you can say, well, I understand that. I understand that. But if it were not for the grace of God, I wouldn't be where I am today. And he loves me tremendously, and he loves you as well. And through the actions of your life, you testify to a God who loves us in a way that would be not understandable to people unless it was demonstrated in your life. So, have you heard the word? Yeah. Are you a doer? Probably less of a doer than a hearer. You probably know more than you do. And if you're like me, that's just always the case. Pray, as James says, to take this word that's already embedded inside of us and to have it erupt into actions, so that great beauty is demonstrated in your life that demonstrates the beauty of who God is. And then suddenly, not that this is the only outcome, but the founders of our country would go, man, that was a close call. We looked like we were just going down into a big cesspool, a whole toilet of just self-consumed people who are warring with one another. But there's just people who decided, no, I'm not going to do that. God saved me when I least deserved it. And in fact, I've never deserved it. And out of his grace, he's made me who I am today. And he's given me a love for those who are not loved in our culture. And he's given me a doer-ness. That's the supreme outworking of what I believe. It's what caused Jesus, when he saw the leper, to not just wave a magic wand and go, you're healed, but to actually approach him and touch him and say, you're healed. Didn't have to do that. It's totally gratuitous. Jesus already demonstrated so many times that he could heal by remote control. Bing! You know what happened? But in this case, he says, no, I want this particular fellow who's never felt the touch of a human being for maybe decades, that at this moment, I want him to feel the touch of a human being that sees him and loves him. What a completely selfless act that is. And believe it or not, God is replicating that attitude in you right now. So be hearers and doers. And come on, when you're on the internet, stop screaming. Be quick to listen. Ask questions. Ask questions. Be like Columbo. Got another question. But delve into people's lives. Find out what they're dealing with. Be quick to listen. Slow to speak. By the way, one last thing. Did you know that this slow to anger thing is a characteristic that's talk about God all the time? God is slow to anger? You've read that in the Old Testament, right? Over and over. I did a count. Where's my count? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I found 8 really quick places where it says God's slow to anger. And you know what? All of us say, amen, because I deserve his anger. That's God. But you know what was always attendant after that phrase that God is slow to anger? There's a phrase that comes with that every single time that James didn't mention. When God is slow to anger, it says every single time, God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. That ought to be your watchword that causes you to be slow to speak. And slow to anger. Because you abound in this kind of steadfast love. And by the way, that word emphasizes a commitment of the will to the well-being of another person. It's not just a lovey-dovey love them. It's to say, I'm committed to your best. It was a conviction of mine as I kind of close this up and finish before coming, is the fact that I never pray for anyone who posts on the internet that makes me angry. I'm never really concerned for their well-being. I just want to correct them because they're wrong and I'm right. We need to take it to heart that even though you don't feel like it, as an act of the will, that's what steadfast love is to hear someone who says something that could, in actual fact, be just completely off the wall. Completely off the wall. And say, God, I want you to intervene in their life. I want you to change things in their life. They're clearly angry about something. I don't totally understand it. And although every natural impulse I have inside of me is to yell at them and to get angry and to speak at them and not listen to them anymore, because I already know what they believe. So I'm just going to speak at it. God, I want you to intercede in their lives and bring life, because they're just looking for life. And you're the source of life. So that's what I've taken away from this, is I need to be much more deliberate and intentional in bringing these people to God, bridling my tongue and asking that God brings life to them. There are a lot of unhappy people in our country right now, a lot of angry people in our country right now, and a lot of people who don't feel like they're getting a fair shake in our country right now. Well, we need to go to God and say, God, will you do something for them? In your steadfast love, will you intercede for them? And will you show that through me, because you're changing me? And that's just a beautiful thing. I want to display your steadfast love as well. And as a result, glorify you. So take whatever level of conviction you need from all that. But look, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. And if you're like God, which he's doing in you, abounding in steadfast love. Abounding in steadfast love. Okay, let's quit. Father in heaven, we thank you for this word you give to us in James. We thank you that he speaks so boldly and brashly to us, it seems like. He just lays it on the table. And Lord, we find ourselves convicted in good kind of ways. You are so beautiful to us. when we see Jesus reflect who you are in the New Testament, we fall in love with the very nature of God as we see his loving kindness displayed in every situation. And Lord, we understand that you are in the process of doing that within us. We're already your children. You've given us the right to be called the children of God, and we are, and that's done, and that's said. But Lord, now that we're your children, now that we didn't have to earn any kind of respect from you, you just gave it to us through the actions of Jesus. We pray that now that you would demonstrate who you are in us, and especially as it comes to the tongue. Bridle our tongue. Make our ears bigger than our tongue, and give us a genuine, abiding, steadfast love for those that we interact with, so that when we do speak a word, when we finally get around to dropping that one little word, the hearer will understand we do it out of love and nothing else. Not contention, not wanting to win an argument for selfish reasons, but because we genuinely want good for them. Because, Lord, there was a time in which we were wayward from you, and you died for us, and that kind of goodness came to us when we least expected it and when we least deserved it. And we discovered your love for us. So thanks for James, in Jesus' name.